racing game friends. Thank you for clicking. Your time is appreciated and I'm so glad you clicked on this video in particular. Neuroscience is super interesting area and I love to share this stuff with you. I hope you'll find it fascinating too. Anyone who has experienced driving games knows that they can require a ton of multitasking type attention. You've probably heard people talk about multitasking as if they're really doing more than one thing at a time, but that's actually impossible due to the limitations of how our brains function. What we actually do is switch our attention from task to task among the multitude of things that we'll set up for ourselves, and this gives the appearance that we're juggling them simultaneously. We'll get into myth-busting attention in a moment, and what that has to do with simulator racing, but let me first introduce some helpful technology and examples of brain behavior under damage or injury to mechanisms that we often take for granted. I mean, imagine living without it. But actually, that's what life is like for millions of people, perhaps even somebody you know. Today, we're going to dive into the science of looking at simulator effects on the brain, especially in recovery from damage or injury, while I introduce a couple of popular simulator game titles on PC. Assetto Corsa and its successor, as well as Project Cars 2. All titles we use in amateur racing training. First up on the list is Assetto Corsa, which is an extremely versatile simulator title widely used and available on Steam. The software has an ecosystem supporting mods that expand on a base in astronomical ways. So many car models and liveries along with tracks and routes. It seems to be the sim of choice for drifters, but really it's great for anybody who's getting started, including karters. This interface, called Content Manager, super big help in organizing your modifications or using it as a race launcher for custom races. Highly recommend to max out your enjoyment on this sim. While there's plenty of anecdotal evidence appearing, it still needs more in-depth study into the specifics of how simulators are capable of regenerating skills needed to operate a motor vehicle. A big one being multitasking. These early studies still provide indicators on how time spent honing skills on screens translates to the real-world skills. We're going to go through a few cool experiments and treatments involving racing and driving simulators that are already being utilized, while also looking at some of the challenges in science of looking at simulators. It's a strong case for why these video games may also be effective medical devices. I'm gonna volunteer to test them. Sign me up! Let's check out this case study real quick. And you can find all the links for this stuff in the description. Here's the abstract. AIM. This study reports the case of a 23-year-old woman, MC, who sustained a severe traumatic brain injury in 2004. After her accident, her driving license was revoked. Oh, how unfortunate. I hate that. Despite recovering normal neuropsychological function in the following years, MC was unable to renew her license, failing 4 on-road evaluations assessing her fitness to drive. Method. In hopes of an eventual license renewal, MC went through an in-simulator training program in laboratory in 2009. The training program aimed at improving the features of MC's driving behavior that were identified as being problematic in prior on-road evaluations. To do so, proper driving behavior was reinforced via driving-specific feedback provided during the training sessions. Results. After 25 sessions in the simulator, over a period of 4 months, MC significantly improved various components of her driving. Notably compared to earlier sessions, later ones were associated with reduced cognitive load, less jerky speed profiles when stopping at intersections, and better vehicle control and positioning. A 1-year retention test showed that most of these improvements were consistent. Conclusions. The learning principles underlying well-conducted simulator-based education programs have a strong scientific basis. A simulator training program represents a promising avenue for driving rehabilitation, It allows individuals without a driving license to practice and improve their skills in a safe and realistic environment. This is just one of the many case studies that researchers are looking at right now when attempting to calculate just how effective racing simulators can be used as tools. Not just to train people as better drivers, but also to promote regeneration of lost brain functions from injury or damage. It's noted in many case studies how much a patient's ability to switch tasks and focus their attention was a culprit behind managing all the tasks necessary to drive, in addition to issues with aggression under stress. This key point indicates that there may be ways to repair that damage over time. In 2007, I was diagnosed with a brain lesion that appeared to possibly be an astrocytoma by teams of physicians consulting on my case at University of Washington's neurosurgery department. At the time, I was experiencing losses of consciousness and difficulty with speech as a 25-year-old with no known medical history of brain injury or issues. See, there it is. There was no way to know when this lesion had appeared or how by this time it was only apparent that it was impacting my ability to function as a normal adult. Sudden losses of consciousness meant having to willingly retire my driver's license, which is probably the worst thing you could ask a motorsports enthusiast to do. Probably one of the worst feelings ever was dropping a few quarters in a California Rush machine, wondering if this was all life was ever going to be from now on, and it felt worse when I couldn't even keep the animated car on the road. Something I took for granted before just wasn't as accessible of a skill anymore. And it's hard to quantify the frustration of grieving such a loss that you hadn't considered could happen to you at 25. Something about it irritated me, enough that it would keep me going back to that machine almost weekly, because of its already convenient location to my normal errands. Even if buying a simulator had occurred to me, my financial situation wouldn't have supported it, and I'm fairly sure that my mother wouldn't have either. She didn't see a value in any video games that I played, so it might have been beyond her to concede that simulators would be more effective at fixing my speech impairment than her efforts at speech therapy. But video games are proving to have profound impacts on brain structure, as we see substantial gray matter can be lost in the hippocampus just from playing 90 hours on a first-person shooter, but boosted by Mario 3D. It ultimately comes down to what a person is playing and how many hours they're dedicating to it. It's entirely true that whatever we practice, we'll become better at it. So, I'm gonna practice getting better at the successor. Assetto, Corsa, Competitizione. I hope I'm even saying that right. I guess I better get better at practicing that. This title is a popular evolution for the serious GT racing crowd, and you can enjoy how graphically awesome it is just by watching competition streams on accounts like Octane Online Racing and BCO Esports on Twitch, if you want to check out more of what it looks like from spectator view. The channels do a fantastic job of hosting races that can be entertaining as the real thing. It's also quite a real feel as a modern simulator software that uses laser scanned tracks to replicate everything down to the track's surface. So if you have the equipment to replicate it, you get a real feel on every bump. You can see how much detail could really end up being beneficial to a person who's trying to regain their ability to coordinate physical tasks and processing related to driving. It's the important thing to keep in mind that when we decide how to spend our time, because there's a consistent regeneration and restructuring happening inside of our brains due to a property called neuroplasticity. Our brains definitely don't stay fixed after development. Even though I'm sure many have told you that people don't change, actually, fundamentally, we're changing every second. But it's things too small to consciously notice. There's just still so much happening at a cellular level. Racing simulators provide a safe environment for anyone, brain injury or not, to test out how a car will feed back with physical inputs. This helps the driver adapt information over time until they can train automated responses that keep them from wrecking out at 200 miles an hour. While many of us would be entering in the brain state of fight or flight, where our brain is flooding itself with neurochemicals that impair specific kinds of performance while enhancing others, but a racer's brain is trained not to trip that mechanism. Something so naturally occurring in survival base can still be tampered, many of the same mechanisms that were affected by brain injuries. These benefits extend beyond the ability to obtain a driver's license again. The way the brain works is by networking together billions of neurons. Different regions of the brain are taking on distributed tasks, from running your heart and your lungs to carefully making decisions for long-term goals or translating stimuluses like sights and sounds. All these things must coordinate for you to even do the simplest of activities. There's a lot happening in our operating system up there at any given time, and it's a myth that we only use 10% of our brain.
To never memorize what you can look up in a book.
Really?
Yeah, leave your brain open for things that are not just facts. Ideas, perspectives, insights, wisdom.
But couldn't your brain handle it if we really use the full capacity of our brains, everything you read in the book in those ideas?
Okay, so this whole thing, we're only using 10% of your brain?
That's not real?
Yeah. No, it's not. No.
What do you mean?
I'm telling you. There's a whole movie based on that premise. The premise is false.
Then what's the truth?
I'll tell you where that line came from. You didn't know about this?
No.
100 some years ago, there was a guy, a brain scientist, who published a paper. Because how do you research what's going on in somebody's brain ethically? You can't. So what happens? People get brain injuries. There'd be something would hit one side of the brain or the other. They test them to see, do they lose their language, their facial recognition, their memory, their short-term memory. They do these experiments on people who had brain injuries. And when he was done, he said, the brain is so complex, we only know what 10% of it is used for. That became, we only use 10% of our brain. Because people want, that's the mantra of the teacher telling the students that they have more potential. So there weren't any forces against that working its way into our culture. But it's a complete misunderstanding of the original sentence where he said we only know what 10% of the brain is doing.
Oh, so having telepathic powers because you're tapping into that post 10% isn't true?
It's called bullshit.
So we is
that loud? Am I loud on that?
I guess you are.
On this episode of Sway's Universe, your Neil deGrasse Tyson illustrate through this myth the dangers of how science studies can be interpreted and used in ways that don't actually reflect what was learned in the experiment. You won't get telepathic powers from using a racing simulator. That's not going to happen no matter what you use. Learning about the many different neuromyths out there can greatly benefit one's life just through some basic knowledge about how the human brain works. Myths like multitasking can make people think that they should be able to balance many activities, even if there's a reason why they may be struggling and they're likely to beat themselves up as being somehow at fault or deficient from others. It can be these myths that stand in the way of understanding real operations in the brain at a mainstream level, and while this initially may not seem like a problem, it's actually the source of many internal personal struggles. And this doesn't apply to all cases, but limitations that we've created with myths and science have stopped progress on discovering tools that would aid recovery in many neurological related issues, sometimes even at a thought level. I mean, take for example, stroke victims. Their perspective on the ability to recover plays a large role in whether or not they do recover from their physical injuries sustained. A research study published in the December 2011 issue of the Journal of Stroke noted that depression is a sense of fatalism were found to be associated with an increased risk of stroke severity, more stroke reoccurrence, and even the rates of death after a stroke. And many more studies besides reiterate the theme of perspective when it comes to recovering. Brain injuries help illustrate better the ways brains can sustain injury in one area, but then still allow people to continue mostly functioning without it being noticed or even gain a new way to do tasks otherwise considered impossible in light of disabilities. Racing games have shined here, where a PhD candidate in computer science at Columbia Engineering, Brian A. Smith, created a new system for blind gamers so that they could enjoy games in a way that sighted people do. Perhaps it's hard to imagine what that's like?
My name is Brian Smith, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Computer Vision Lab here at Columbia. And I'm the creator and the developer of the Racing Auditory Display, the RAD. And what it is a way of making it possible for people who are blind to play racing games and have the same sort of experience playing those games as sighted players can. To be able to do things like cut corners, anticipate upcoming turns, remember the track layout, and all of the things that sighted players are used to doing in racing games.
It was interesting to try the RAD because of the new experience that it gave to me as a visually impaired person in relation to playing racing games.
The RAD is a user interface that can be added to any racing game. It's just a means of, given a racing game, a developer can plug in the RAD, and then that will output sound to a player's headphones to give them information about the racetrack. And so just to prove that he is not using the screen or the visual information, the graphics at all, I'm going to turn the screen away from him. So he's not looking at the screen at all, and yet he's still able to play the game and even kind of cut this corner. This is turn 17, it's a really long turn.
This feeling of, I guess you can say the feeling of adventure that it gave, the sense of control that it gave me as a player was totally different than what you would usually get from other audio racing games that were specifically designed for the visually impaired community.
So right now, if you look at the types of video games that are available to people who are blind, it's a pretty sparse field. They're very simplified versions of what sighted people would play. They either cut out a lot of the game mechanics and higher level strategies that you might expect. So in racing games, for example, there are no concepts of cutting corners. Or they overload the player with too much information. And so here our goal was to give people who are blind an authentic experience so that they could play racing games the same way that sighted players would experience racing games, with all of the information that they would normally have to decide how to race themselves without overloading them with information.
I am listening to the different information that I get, which is the sounds of when I'm approaching a turn.
We've actually found that the RAD helps people who are blind race as well as casual sighted players can. We compared lap times from sighted people and blind participants, and they were comparable. Now, if you have a really good sighted player, they can do better because they can hug corners just even more precisely than what the RAD would allow you to do. But the fact that like a regular 3D racing game can be playable by someone who's blind at a level that's comparable to sighted players is a completely new thing.
Because of the brain's ability to use multiple stimulus, these blind gamers are performing just as well as an average sighted player too, through use of racing simulator gaming software. Even some permanent conditions can compensate using other mechanisms. These kinds of experiments demonstrate so many neuromyths about brains being fixed are inaccurate. It's rather fun racing simulators can be used for so many forms of testing. This computer program is so much more than a game, even if it promotes all the escapism just through some immersive peripheral devices, many of which are becoming widely available to the general consumer through gaming and the competitors that are entering the industry. Give the humble simulator some credit. It's gone beyond being just a video game, and it's started to prove itself as a viable trainer and now a medical treatment too. It's made its way onto national airwaves now that NASCAR's use of iRacing for the 2020 season surviving COVID. As the industry is progressing into using those super accurate laser scan tracks, it's also incorporated a new large leap called horizon locking, which more closely mimics what a driver would experience in real life compared to how a typical game camera behaves. And if you really want to step up into the whole new field of depth, VR is available on most of these software titles. Today, much of the realism comes through the tire models being incorporated by engineers. That's become a refining point for giving more accurate feedback to users. Reading off a section from Paradigm Racing here, hope this will describe it well. They will see the track as unmoving because of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. This causes the eyes to rotate and move in response to signals from the inner ear to keep the image stable. In short, your inner ear knows which way is up, and this tells the eyes how to move and maintain this orientation. This system works regardless of neck or body movement. Whether a driver's head and body is strapped into the seat or otherwise makes no difference. If the driver tilts their head, the eyes will rotate to keep the track at horizon level. If the car hits a bump and the driver's head is tilted to the side with the car, the eyes will rotate to keep the horizon level. If the car enters a banked turn, the same thing happens. The end result is that no matter what the car or driver does, their eyes will maintain the Earth as an unmoving reference frame because of the amazing capabilities of the vestibular system. I don't know how often people consider how the advancements like these are going to have a massive impact on the simulator's ability to replicate real life, and train a more precise degree. To trick our brain into believing that it's a real-life situation, where it needs those task-switching skills for survival, that it's the ability to be more effective at helping recovery from injury comes through these minor advances, like how the vision is translated or feedback is input. Definitely gives engineers who code games a bit more to think about here. That's why we're moving into a title that's more associated with gaming than being a simulator, Project Cars 2. It's the latest release has gone nearly full-blown Need for Speed, but the second installment of the series was regarded as being closely simulator-worthy. I also agree. The feedback and feel on it is much closer to the realism and difficulty like Assetto Corsa. There isn't the flashy optical illusion effects used in a lot of mainstream racing games, none of that motion blur or cut up to the close-up corner so that it makes you feel like you were going faster and took a perfect corner exit. It's not California Rush, that's for sure, but who knows how much that game and others have had to do with my recovery. Other than the occasional stumbles and pronunciation of words, it might be hard to tell that the impairment was ever a problem, or that it takes effort to sound the way that I did before the losses of consciousness started. While the appearance of the lesion has disappeared, leaving the question of what or it ever was or why it showed up, there are still residual effects I experience with cognitive impairment, none of which prevent me from being able to drive a car, not only safely, but sometimes even pushing some competitive boundaries in racing. Yet I'm still able to refrain from speeding tickets. The more I play with simulators, the easier it gets, and can only confirm the motivation to race may have created a belief system that wouldn't allow the doubt to creep in that I wouldn't race again. I just wasn't going to acknowledge life without it. I mean, racing is life, folks. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Neuroscientists are definitely coming up with some creative ways to put technology to use and alter it for the purposes that they're attempting to achieve. This next experiment to share is about Adam Gasly's work at the University of San Francisco with the creation of a particular type of racing game, NeuroRacer, and some exciting implications about what it can do beyond entertaining oneself.
When we ask parents, would you prefer to give your child a drug or have them play a video game? They're like, well, they already play video games, so why don't we start with that? We already have this exciting behavioral platform to help improve performance. What we're doing is really trying to create an entire new category of medicine. For the last 25 years, I've been exploring how the brain works, what makes it sensitive to interference that prevents you from performing at the highest level of your abilities. I decided around 8 years ago to actually build tools to improve how the brain functions and then lead to a better quality of people's lives. The work that we were doing was so cutting edge that we found that we didn't actually have a laboratory to do the type of work that we were conceiving of. Our goal is really to bridge the latest advances in high tech with neuroscience. And so in order to do that, we needed a very interactive media lab that was focused on neurology, psychiatric care, that had the ability for blood draws, that had brain scans. So that's what we built in the Neuroscape lab. The first thing that we did was create a video game called NeuroRacer that challenges older adults in this very intense multitasking way, with the hope that other abilities that are related to multitasking would improve as the result of getting better at the game. What we found with this game was, first of all, that multitasking abilities really reach a peak at the early 20s and then decline straight through our lives. The good news is that we found that when we took a group of 60 to 80-year-olds and had them play the game at home for 12 hours over the course of a month, we could revert their ability to multitask in the game back to the level of 20-year-olds. But perhaps what was most exciting about the results of this study was that we found that we also improved their working memory. So that was really the big win, that things that we were not directly training on the game actually improved through gameplay. We now have several studies that are just beginning to go through the full FDA approval process. The first condition is for ADHD, but autism is not far behind it. One game that we're very excited about is called Body Brain Trainer, or BBT. And what BBT does is that it challenges you both physically and cognitively in one game experience. There's massive enthusiasm about this for different conditions, for example, Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis, which has both movement issues as well as cognitive challenges. The work that we do is really one of a kind. There's so much interest at UCSF from scientists and physicians that work in different populations that they take care of, ranging from ADHD, autism, depression, anxiety, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease. And we don't have enough room to develop and also do these type of clinical trials. So the expansion of the Neuroscape lab is essentially to set up a unique clinical platform to do this next generation of testing new innovative brain improvement tools. We have interest from all over the world, both in using our tools and also applying them in unique ways to populations that we haven't even considered. And we're very excited about helping to seed these ideas. We know that the biggest, broadest global impact will happen not with us just doing the work here at UCSF, but everyone participating in it. Recently, we found that the NIH is willing to fund research in the domain of video games as therapeutics. But despite that, this work is still so cutting edge that we rely largely on the generosity of philanthropy to fund this type of work. I've been to the White House several times to speak about the potential of using video games to improve attention and quality of life. So right across the board, from the very highest levels, we have great interest in how we can create an entirely new way of using video games to improve the quality of our minds.
This game could viably be treatment for cognitive decline, or even some other neurophenomenon like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You know, the ADHD thing that everybody talks about, which is something that's been widely debated, especially when it comes to the issues of whether or not pharmaceuticals are an appropriate treatment given a child's age and developing brain. With options like NeuroRacer, it would provide other methods to improve focus or help in addition with other treatments. But that might not be too difficult to get a youngin' to play racing games. It would seem more like a reward than punishment. NeuroRacer is a great demonstration of exactly why our modern connotation for multitasking really isn't accurate to what's happening inside the brain. Users have to balance the task of driving while also recognizing the signals and symbols added to the task. That addition of the symbol task is forcing participants to shift their attention even if it's only for a split second, and in doing so increases the brain's ability to shift quickly and appears, on the outside, like that brilliant juggling act. Let's hear more about what this looks like from another perspective. A short order cook.
But first, NPR's John Hamilton begins our story in a place where you can hear multitasking, smell it, even taste it.
It's a diner. Hi, how are you? The Tasty Diner in Bethesda, Maryland.
Run two, one with scrapple, one with hash, one rye only.
To survive as a short order cook here, you have to keep a half dozen orders in your head while flipping pancakes, cracking eggs,
bacon, egg, and cheese bagel,
working the counter, and refilling coffee cups.
That's all. Half a grapefruit, please.
They're small tasks. On a busy day, though, they can add up to a tough job for Sean Swinson.
My first month here, I was ready to walk out the door.
Where's my oatmeal, Marisol?
What does it feel like when you're in the middle of rush hour? I mean, what does it feel like to...
Like you're in a insane asylum.
Stack.
Almost unbearable.
Scrambled ham steak. Over bacon, 1 wheat only.
Swinson has learned to handle the pressure.
Ready for another one, gentlemen?
He's an island of calm even when the orders are flying.
2 orders of mini chocolate chip.
But Swinson's boss, Frank Long, says very few people can keep up without losing their cool.
And it's the most difficult job in this type of operation. Every table's occupied, 4 cooks, 5 waitresses, getting them in and out.
So when does it get the craziest? When the customers are multitasking too.
Lunchtime. People may have an errand to run, maybe go to the bank, maybe pick up some dry cleaning and eat. All, say, within an hour or whatever a lot of time they have.
It's all part of life these days. We answer emails while yapping on the phone. We schedule appointments while driving and listening to the radio. And it seems as if we're focusing on all these tasks simultaneously, as if we become true masters of doing 10 things at once. But brain researchers say, not so much.
People can't multitask very well. And when people say they can, it's usually because they're deluding themselves. The brain is very good at deluding itself.
Earl Miller, a Pickauer professor of neuroscience at MIT, says for the most part we simply can't focus on more than one thing at a time. What we can do, Miller says, is shift our focus from one thing to the next with astonishing speed.
Switching from task to task, you think you're actually paying attention to everything around you at the same time, but you're actually not. You're paying attention to maybe 1 or 2 things simultaneously, but switching between them very, very rapidly.
Miller says there are several reasons the brain has to switch among tasks. One is that similar tasks compete to use the same resources in the brain.
Think about writing an email and talking on the phone at the same time. You cannot focus on one while doing the other. That's because there's a lot of what's called interference between the 2 tasks. They're very similar to one another. They both involve communicating via speech or written word, and so there's a lot of conflict between the 2 of them, and they're really nearly impossible to do at the same time.
Researchers can actually see the brain struggling, and now they're trying to figure out the details of what's going on.
I'll just check and see if they're ready for you. Can you hang on 1 second right here?
We're at a lab at the University of Michigan, in the control room of an MRI scanner. On the other side of a thick pane of glass, a young man is lying face up inside a giant magnet.
Okay, we're going to do another quick scan of your brain. You don't need to do anything, just keep your head still.
The neuroscientist in charge is Daniel Weissman, who explains that the man in the scanner will be performing different tasks depending on the color of 2 numbers he sees on a screen.
And if the 2 digits are one color, say red, the subject decides which digit is numerically larger. On the other hand, if the digits are a different color, say green, then the subject decides which digit is actually printed in a larger font size.
Got that? If you didn't, maybe it's because these tasks were designed to be tricky.
Great, we're going to go ahead and begin.
MRI studies like this one have shown that when the man in the scanner sees green, his brain has to pause before responding to round up all the information it has about the green task. When the man sees red, his brain pauses again to push aside information about the green task and replace it with information about the red task.
If you can go ahead and try to respond a little faster for this next run, that would be great.
If the tasks were simpler, they might not require this sort of full-throttle switching.
All right, here we go.
But Weissman says even simple tasks can overwhelm the brain when we try to do several at once.
If I'm out on a street corner and I'm looking for one friend who's wearing a red scarf, I might be able to pick out that friend. But if I'm looking for a friend who's wearing a red scarf and on one street corner, and in the middle of the street I'm looking for another friend who's wearing a blue scarf, and on the other side of the street I'm looking for a friend who's wearing a green scarf, at some point I can only divide my attention so much.
So the brain starts switching. Scan for red, switch. Scan for blue, switch. Scan for green, switch. The part of the brain that does this is called the executive system. It's a bit like one of those cartoon conductors telling the orchestra, louder, softer, faster, slower. The conductor in our heads lives in the brain's frontal lobes, basically above our eyes.
So executive processes allow us to make plans for our future behaviors. They allow us to exert some sort of voluntary control over our behavior.
The executive system also helps us achieve a goal by ignoring distractions.
So, for example, if we're performing a task where we want to watch TV and ignore voices that are coming from, our children nearby, our frontal regions of the brain may configure the rest of the brain to prioritize visual information and dampen down auditory information.
And the brain's executive will keep us in that mode until we hear, say, one of our children screaming.
These are the things that make us most human. Humans are able to exert free will. We are not like jellyfish. It's not that when you poke us, we always do the same thing.
We're also not like cats or dogs or even apes when it comes to controlling how our brain responds and what it responds to. Weissman says this skill probably evolved to help humans, who are pretty vulnerable physically, do things like hunt animals that are bigger and stronger.
Hunting requires a lot of planning, right? You've got to think about, well, what's that tiger going to do? And I've got my group of friends. How can we coordinate ourselves and surround the tiger?
And keeping track of all of these things wouldn't be possible without the executive system, that symphony conductor in our frontal lobes.
There are lots of animals in the world that hunt without these increased abilities. So I wouldn't say that to be a good hunter you have to have a lot of frontal development. But on the other hand, it helps, right? This is why humans have become dominant on the planet.
And perhaps too confident in our own skill. Studies show that we frequently overestimate our ability to handle multiple tasks. For early humans, that sort of miscalculation could have meant becoming a tiger's lunch. These days, the consequences are more likely to be stress, a blunder, or a car crash. John Hamilton, NPR News.
Take 3. Even for someone with an injury or damage can benefit from this training on a simulator, especially if their race activities have them multitasking. Games such as Wipeout or the F-Zero series provide much of this attention-splitting action, flying gravity-defying hovercrafts while also trying to take down your opponent with strategic weapons like mines meant to trip up the pack behind you, or rocket boosters that are well placed in the sprint section of the track. Controllers will get this job done, but adding the wheel and pedal combination to the equation means considering more coordination and regions of the brain that have to work together as a part of the training. This leads to subsequent benefits related to the connection between what the eyes see and how the hands move to compensate. My own experience with simulators and recovery from damage seen in my brain via MRI has certainly proved to me their value, even when I was using equipment completely unintended for anything other than sheer entertainment. Not only am I driving today, sometimes I'm even a decent racer. Sometimes. Focus can still actually be a huge challenge, and perhaps always will be given that I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid, but no longer crippled by an inability to control my brain's transmission. Essentially, it's just shifting back to a state where it's functional. Neuroplasticity is taking place whether we realize it or not. Whatever we choose to do with our time is shaping our brains around those activities. Perhaps it will give many more a lot to consider about how they spend their free times. And hey, games isn't a bad choice. Better than TV. I mean, there was another study released on what TV does to your brain this week, and I'll get to that on the channel another time. But there's amazing ways that games are changing the way we operate. From racing simulators to exploration games, the digital landscapes are adapting our brains in good ways and in bad. It's just up to us to tune what that benefits us the most. Whether you're trying to get better at multitasking or healing from a major brain injury, simulators can be a surprisingly fun way to network the brain to a new level of efficiency capable of incredible task switching. focus or even redistributing tasks across the brain regions to help humans adapt. You can imagine the joy of being able to play a racing game when you've never been able to see, and it's cool to fathom that one day these translational abilities will change lives in huge ways through gaming technology. Racing simulators are shaping up to be a huge part of our future of medical devices. On this channel, we'll be tracking the progress. Sharing is caring and science is fun, so if you come across these cool studies like these, please do comment below or drop them in the Discord. Take care, y'all. Bye-bye!